Welcome back to another episode of What's Going On, a Social Studies Network podcast. I'm Maeve.
And I'm Mary, and this is a podcast where we talk about different topics in the social studies field. Today we're talking about cultural diversity in a classroom. So, what's going on?
So, many educators may have seen on February 14th that the acting assistant secretary for Civil Rights United States Department of Education released a statement stating that the federal government will withdraw funding from schools that promote a diverse curriculum or provide economic opportunities to lower income students. What many Illinois educators may have seen was Dr. Tony Sanders, the Illinois Superintendent of Education, responded in the ISB weekly message, basically pointing out how the federal government cannot make those kinds of changes to federal law. In the weekly newsletter, Sanders had a very strong statement which read, "As a local school district leader, I would routinely ask, who among us does not want to see their culture uplifted in our curriculum?" Which really ties into our topic for today, cultural diversity.
Yes.
From what I've mentioned, Mary, what do you think of this?
I think that's something people tend to misunderstand, and that perhaps is a widespread belief right now, is that cultural diversity means putting down or discriminating against people that might be in the majority, when it's really not. Something that Dr. Sanders said that I really resonate with is that we want to see our own culture reflected on the curriculum, and I don't think it has to come to the expense of other people's culture.
I think that encompasses what we wanted to talk about today, our topic for today being cultural diversity. We kind of came to this topic idea discussing how it's currently Black History Month. While we're recording, it's Black History Month. I know when this episode comes out, it won't be Black History Month anymore. It will be Women's History Month, though. But all that being said, we wanted to take the time to discuss how teachers and educators can continue to promote a culturally diverse curriculum in their classroom.
I think culture, especially in social studies classes, is very important, and it should take a great part of our curriculum because culture is something that pervades our lives everywhere, inside the classroom and outside the classroom. And we've repeated that sentiment many times because it's true. It can give you a sense of belonging and a good understanding of your identity because it gives you a point of connection with other people that are similar to you and sometimes even different from you because you're able to see the similarities and differences that you have with them. In terms of our curriculum, it's important to bring it in and explore it with your students because it can help them build a more nuanced understanding of different events and histories and help them break away from very, let's say, Eurocentric or very Western idea of how history played out and how different parties interact with one another.
Mm-hmm.
Something interesting that you're bringing up that I find really intriguing is that there's diversity among students, but that there's not really a lot of diversity among teachers. Thankfully, we've been having more teachers from different backgrounds and ethnicities getting into teaching, but there's still a very high percentage of white teachers, and that may not necessarily reflect the students that they're teaching. I think even if these teachers aren't white, many times teachers are going to be teaching in classrooms that don't reflect their own identity. So there might be some struggle in trying to bring in more diverse material or trying to talk about identity, diversity, race, and ethnicity if it's not your own. So something I want to bring up is, what do you think teachers should do to bring out culture in students? How do they introduce it in the classroom and do it in a respectful manner?
I really like that question because I definitely agree that teachers don't always represent their students. And that's true because the teacher's only one person. They can't be the same as every student. And that's a good thing, and at times it's a bad thing. And I also agree that at times I am perceived as that stereotypical white female teacher who won't understand their students. So I constantly think about how can I uplift my students from diverse backgrounds? How can I take the time to understand them? One thing that I think about a lot is this is a great opportunity for students to become the teacher and to teach the teacher and their classmates about their culture and their experiences. This can be through presentations or just conversations, maybe one-on-one or full class discussions.
That's interesting. It kind of reminds me of something that we've said before in our little series here, is that sometimes you have to learn alongside your students. There are things that you won't understand that maybe they do. Maybe they have some experiences that they can bring into the classroom and they can tell you about. And like we've been saying as well, as a teacher, you might make some mistakes, but it's okay, you know?
Yeah.
It's a collaborative type of learning. And in times like that, it's also very nice to sometimes let students take the lead, right?
Yes.
Act as a facilitator and let them guide conversations to topics they find interesting, and then ask them, what do you find interesting? How does this connect back to our topics?
Definitely, like something we said just in our last episode, it is the job of the teacher to listen. And this is a great opportunity for teachers to listen to their students. Another great way to promote diversity is through pop culture, which is really amazing. Just looking at the Super Bowl, we can analyze Kendrick Lamar's halftime show in our social studies classrooms, because outside of it being a big diss on Drake, there are times in his songs where he looks back on moments in Black history and really calls attention to these significant moments in Black history and American history.
And like Kendrick Lamar said in his performance, this is more than just about music. I think that the reason why his performance has been such a hot topic, especially for students, it's because it's more than just what he's saying in the music sphere, you know. As you said, it's more than just a diss. It's also about the way he's exploring race and using music as a form of activism. And branching off of that, we've seen music being used as forms of activism also for artists like Bad Bunny, who use their music to talk about their culture or country's problems, such as Puerto Rico's gentrification, displacement, and the changing customs of his country. I've seen both artists actually come up in my classes for different reasons. And both of them have been kind of conductive to starting these conversations. A lot of times students get invested in what they're saying, and they're very excited that they're able to understand what is being said. I think when it comes to, like, let's say more formal literature or like research, sometimes students won't connect with that as strongly because they see it as like separate from their personal lives, like part of the academic world and not maybe what they'd encounter in their personal lives in their free time. But you know, these messages and these topics are things that do come up in their day-to-day lives.
I think educators often forget. They get so involved in like the curriculum and like what they're teaching that they forget how powerful things like music can be on students. Some other things we can look at are food, languages, and culturally significant Some other things we can look at are food, language, and culturally significant holidays. But as we have this conversation, it's also important to dissect the difference between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. How would you define cultural appreciation versus cultural appropriation?
I think when it comes to cultural appropriation and appreciation, there's a certain like fine line and difference there is when you're approaching like customs, language, food that's outside of your culture. When it comes to appropriation, you're not recognizing the cultural significance between something, and you're presenting that culture as being very static or very simple, right? Sometimes appropriation comes with a carelessness or lack of understanding, and I think that's what differentiates it within. between appreciation, because appreciation is being able to see these customs, foods, all that, and being able to recognize why they're important and what your relationship to it is.
I agree. There's definitely a level of understanding. And whether you're going to appreciate culture or somehow appropriate it, you need to pretty much check yourself, check your intentions. Are you approaching this culture or this culture's identity with a sense of malice or curiosity? Is your understanding of this culture based on stereotypes or researched understanding? I think this is where a lot of people become afraid because there is so much self reflection that goes into appreciating a culture that it can be frustrating that there's so much work involved. But these are things that when you put in a lot of effort, you are able to reap some very large rewards.
Aside from being able to engage with maybe your own culture more wholeheartedly, you're able to also share it with other people, and you're able to come away with this nuanced understanding built with empathy and collaboration and perhaps solidarity that comes with putting in the work, as you said.
And that's when the line becomes a bit fuzzy, when maybe your student or someone you know begins to share their culture with you. How much of that is putting their culture maybe for sharing or to invite you to participate in that culture? That's a very heavy conversation.
As educators, sometimes we do come across conversations between students, or maybe these students are coming up to us and telling us about their cultural experiences and all that. And like you said, sometimes you have to wonder, are we being invited, or is there a certain limit that you have to with yourself in regards to that student's culture? For example, a student might tell you like something personal about their culture, like, oh yeah, my parents do something this way, or we celebrate this and this and this and this way. And you have to wonder, is this a go ahead from the student telling you, I want you to know this, I want you to maybe explore this more in depth, or is it just something personal with your student?
I think that's great, to create that environment where students feel open to share. But it is kind of a conversation. Well, it doesn't need to be an upfront conversation of like, what do you mean by this? But like, something you'll have to gauge from your students. Like, is this something they want me to expand on, or is this something they just wish to share and move on from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something that sometimes you say is that you have to read the room. Mm-hmm. You have to be kind of careful of why students are telling you what they are, and making sure to maintain those personal connections with students in a respectful manner. Mm-hmm. Students might tell you something simply because they trust you and they find you to be someone very supportive and understanding, but they might not be comfortable sharing what they've told you to the rest of the class. For example, when it comes to culture, sometimes people are very hesitant to share something cultural with others because they feel like it will be misunderstood, or that other people might find it funny or whatever. Mm-hmm. And you have to be careful when you're sharing that, because you don't want the student's culture to be laughed at or misunderstood, or, like we've been saying, appropriated. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I agree with what you said, and I was thinking that from personal experience, there are aspects of my culture that I don't often share because generationally there's been this invisible force asking me to suppress it and maybe not bring it up.
I was thinking that kind of reminds me of when students try to separate like maybe their professional life and their personal life. They're like, especially in like Black community, they're like, oh, this is too ghetto, right? Mm-hmm. And they try to separate that, and that's why they have code switching, because there are some parts they feel aren't acceptable in more professional or academic spaces, but they are important to who they are.
I think it's interesting, like, that we keep bouncing around this idea of like, it isn't professional, or it might be seen as such and such, but there really is no one person saying, like, don't talk like that. Most of the time, there isn't one person saying, don't talk like that, don't talk about that. It's what we observe from the space around us. So I think that's, again, why it's important for teachers to create that space, safe space, where students can express their culture, express who they are.
I feel like when it comes to students, there's this sentiment, especially like within their communities and in their culture, that they have to balance who they are culturally. They want to be recognized as part of their culture, but also American and able to assimilate in a way to more dominant cultural expressions.
The teacher can also be that safe space. As we talked about many times, the teacher is a great as we've talked about many times, the teacher can be a great example, a great resource. And they can teach through modeling by sharing their own culture if they feel comfortable and sharing their own experiences to elicit that safe space environment and also be a resource for their students on a culture that they might not know much about.
Right now, I'm thinking about when I was in high school, I had a Mexican teacher who was teaching Spanish to, the rest of my classmates and I. And she was very open about who she was and the kinds of things she enjoyed, especially when it came to her music. I think because it was so easy for her to share that with us, be so enthusiastic about it, it was a lot easier to share personal interests with her and cultural interests as well. In that case, we did have the same culture, so I guess there is that added easiness to it. But I feel like even if she wasn't Mexican and even if she had different culture, if she had shown that same enthusiasm, it would be kind of like an entryway to saying, I feel like I'm going to be valued, respected, and understood in this space. As we've been saying, the teacher can be very important when it comes to culture and such, and they can often take the role as a role model or as a facilitator. And it could also be very helpful if they not only facilitate these conversations, but if they introduce cultural discussions like my teacher did, or if these students bring in their own personal cultures, ask them to look deeper into what they're introducing and question it. Not in a necessarily critical way, but ask them, what do you find interesting about it? What do you like? What don't you like? So that students can build that understanding and nuance and have that opportunity for discussion.
I do recognize that a lot of my teachers in the schools I went to growing up did look like me and have very similar cultures to me. And that's something I love about coming to a larger university where other cultures are appreciated and shared, and there is opportunities to learn more about cultures that differ from my own.
I think I had a very similar experience, even outside of class. Because of university, I've had the opportunity to interact with people that are different from me. Like I've said time and time again, I come from a primarily Hispanic high school, but here I've been able to meet a whole bunch of different people. And I think it's because of the curiosity that's been fostered in me because of the books I've read, because of the teachers I've had, all that. I've always found it very interesting to ask other people about their culture and have discussions about it. And when you open yourself up to that, you kind of realize there's a lot of similarities to them.
Culture is a great thing to discuss with other people, no matter how they feel, how a person may feel towards their culture, whether it be negative or positive. People love to talk about themselves. They love to talk about their culture. And while they may not be inviting you in to participate in their culture at times, they may be inviting you into a conversation for you to share about your culture. So some things that we've seen here at the university and in our own experiences that help promote that safe space and cultural diverse education are allowing students to present their culture and discuss their culture on their own and do their research. What's another? Damn, I had and promoting diverse discussion between students. What are some other tools and strategies we can use to promote these kinds of conversations?
Something that we've said over and over again is that you have to create a very safe space, one that encourages these types of discussions and that students feel comfortable in. And in this space, you do want to explore different cultures, let students talk and even debate amongst themselves about different parts of cultures. When you're teaching students about culture, you also want to be very explicit about the purpose of it and why you're exposing them to all these different perspectives. Especially like you were saying before, in as we were discussing earlier in our current events, you want to be explicit about the purpose of multiculturalism and diversity, because if you don't, there is a risk of misunderstanding, right? We don't want to give students the impression that we're just doing it simply for fun, right? It is fun, but we do want to be like, there is a purpose to me exposing you to cultures that you understand or you may not be familiar with, because it isn't about discriminating against you or showing you less representation about you, but bringing in all these different types of representation so that you could build a more unified sense of the world and create more empathy and, you know, bring all these positive things into one's life. You do want to also bring these conversations and create this kind of culture of understanding outside of the classroom as well. You want to emphasize community. Like we said in one of our videos, you might want to bring in parents that have experience in certain things into the classroom so they can talk about it. But you could also advocate for your schools reaching out to parents, even if they might not be able to come into the classroom, so that they can know what's going on in the classroom and let them explore that too, because students are going into the classroom, but they also have their lives outside. If they're different, they might not have a very solidified sense of why these things are important.
These are definitely great ways to combat that self-suppression we feel and students feel in the classroom and in our current environment. Because when students are allowed to be themselves, they flourish and they create a better environment for themselves and those around them. It can almost be said that when you value the culture, you value the individual. And this is especially important in our climate today, where it may feel like we're all trying to be unified into one singular thing. This is why it's so important to teach with hope and create that partnership between the student and the teacher, the student and the student, and the student and their community.
So today we talked about what's going on in our nation and the different legislations and responses there are to it, why culture is important and why we should uplift it in our curriculum, ways to bring it into the classroom, such as through pop culture, art, music, and other things that might interest students, what the role of the teacher is, especially in facilitating, introducing, and questioning these topics, and the positive effects that we might see in bringing in culture.
This has been another episode of What's Going On. I'm Maeve.
And I'm Mary. Thank you for watching, and make sure to take care and stay aware.